The wind howled through the empty streets of South Chicago as Officer Michael Reynolds pulled his patrol car into the parking lot of the 24-hour convenience store. The clock on his dashboard read 2:17 a.m. He'd been doing this job for 15 years, and the graveyard shift still felt as lonely as ever. The store's fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow across the fresh dusting of snow that had begun to fall. Dispatch to Unit 247, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "We've got reports of suspicious noises behind the quick stop on Wilson Street. Possible disturbance." Michael clicked his radio. Unit 247 responding. "I'm already on scene." He stepped out of his worn car into the biting December air, his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. The backlot of the store was poorly lit, with only one flickering security light illuminating the dumpster area. Michael pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as he walked carefully through the new snow. At first, everything seemed normal, just another false alarm on a quiet winter night. But then he heard it, a faint sound, almost like a kitten's cry, coming from near the dumpster. Michael had investigated hundreds of similar calls over the years, usually finding nothing more than stray cats or raccoons rummaging through garbage. "Hello," he called out, more from habit than expectation of a response. The crying sound came again, weaker this time. Moving closer to the dumpster, Michael noticed something unusual, a small piece of cloth sticking out from under some cardboard boxes. His heart began to beat faster as he moved the boxes aside. There, wrapped in what looked like an old dish rag, was a tiny baby. The infant's dark skin was turning a frightening shade of blue from the cold. "Oh my God," Michael whispered, immediately dropping to his knees. With trembling hands, he reached out to touch the baby's chest. There was movement, shallow breathing, but breathing nonetheless. The baby couldn't have been more than a few hours old. The umbilical cord was still attached. "Dispatch." Michael's voice cracked as he grabbed his radio. "I need an ambulance at my location immediately. I've got an abandoned newborn critical condition." Without waiting for a response, he shrugged off his thick police jacket and carefully wrapped it around the tiny body. The baby was so cold, so fragile, like holding an ice sculpture that might shatter at any moment. Michael held the infant close to his chest, trying to share his body heat while gently rubbing the baby's back. "Stay with me, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just stay with me." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, but they seemed a lifetime away. Michael kept talking to the baby, words of comfort and encouragement flowing naturally, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort the infant or himself. In 15 years on the force, he'd seen his share of heartbreaking situations, but this was different. Something about this tiny life, discarded like yesterday's trash, struck him to his very core. The baby made a weak, whimpering sound, and Michael felt tears forming in his eyes. He'd always prided himself on staying professional, keeping emotional distance, but standing there in the snow, holding this abandoned child, all his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. The ambulance finally arrived, its red lights painting the snow-covered scene in surreal flashes of color. As the paramedics rushed toward him with their equipment, Michael found himself reluctant to let go. He watched as they quickly assessed the baby, attached monitoring equipment, and placed the tiny body on a warming pad. "You want to ride with us?" one of the paramedics asked, noting Michael's obvious concern. Michael nodded, already climbing into the ambulance. As they sped toward the hospital, he found himself holding the baby's tiny hand, marveling at how something so small could suddenly feel so important. The paramedics worked efficiently around him, inserting IVs and monitoring vital signs, but Michael barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the weak but steady grip of those tiny fingers around his much larger one. In that moment, though he didn't fully understand it yet, Michael Reynolds' life had changed forever. The lonely nights, the empty apartment he returned to after each shift, the sense that something was missing from his life, it all suddenly made sense. Sometimes the biggest changes come in the smallest packages, and sometimes the most important calls of an officer's career don't involve guns, car chases, or dramatic arrests. Sometimes they involve nothing more than a tiny hand reaching out from a discarded dish rag, asking for a chance at life. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor seemed to buzz louder with each passing hour. Michael sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair outside the ICU, his uniform wrinkled from wearing it for nearly 24 hours straight. His fellow officers had offered to cover his shifts, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Every time he thought about heading home, he remembered those tiny fingers gripping his hand in the ambulance. Through the large window, he could see the medical team working tirelessly. The baby, still unnamed, still unclaimed, lay in an incubator connected to what seemed like endless tubes and wires. Michael had never felt so helpless in his life. On the streets, he knew what to do, how to handle any situation. But here, all he could do was watch and wait. "Officer Reynolds." A nurse touched his shoulder gently, startling him from his thoughts. She held out a cup of coffee. "You've been here all night again." Michael accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Any changes?" "He's fighting hard," she said, sitting down beside him. "His body temperature is finally stable, and his breathing is getting stronger. But the next 48 hours will be crucial." Michael rubbed his tired eyes, trying to process the information. The nurse, her name tag read Linda, had been kind enough to explain everything in simple terms. The baby had suffered from severe hypothermia, and there were concerns about potential organ damage. But somehow, against all odds, this tiny fighter kept holding on. Throughout the day, a steady stream of police officers stopped by. Some brought food, others just quiet support. Michael's captain even visited, expressing concern about both the baby and his devoted officer. "Mike, you should get some rest," his captain suggested, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can't help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." But Michael couldn't explain the invisible thread that seemed to tie him to this child. Every time a machine beeped or a doctor rushed in, his heart would stop until he knew everything was okay. He'd seen countless tragedies in his career, but something about this one was different. This wasn't just another case, this was personal. On the third day, while Michael was dozing in his chair, he heard excited voices from inside the NICU. His eyes snapped open to see doctors gathered around the incubator. His heart dropped until he saw their smiles. Linda rushed out to him, beaming. "He's showing significant improvement. Would you like to come in and see him?" After putting on a sterile gown and washing his hands thoroughly, Michael followed her into the unit. The baby looked so different from that cold night behind the store. His skin had a healthy glow now, and though he was still tiny, he no longer seemed quite so fragile. "You can touch him," Linda encouraged, helping Michael position his hand through the incubator's opening. The moment Michael's finger touched the baby's palm, those tiny fingers wrapped around it again, just like in the ambulance. But this time, the grip was stronger. Michael looked down to find two bright eyes staring up at him with what seemed like recognition. "Hey there, little fighter," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You're doing so great." A young doctor approached, clipboard in hand. "Officer Reynolds, you should know. We've had no response to the notices about an abandoned baby. After 5 days, if no one comes forward." Michael nodded, understanding the unspoken message. This child would enter the system, become another statistic. The thought made his chest tight. That evening, as he finally drove home to shower and change, Michael couldn't stop thinking about the baby. His apartment felt emptier than ever, the silence deafening. On his coffee table lay a stack of unopened mail and magazines, one featuring an article about fostering children. He'd picked it up at the hospital, but hadn't had the courage to read it yet. Sitting down heavily on his couch, Michael pulled out his phone and looked at the picture Linda had taken of him with the baby. He thought about his own life, the lonely shifts, the quiet holidays, the sense that he was meant for something more than just patrolling streets and filing reports. For the first time in years, he found himself praying. Not the formal prayers of his childhood, but simple, honest words from his heart. He asked for guidance, for strength, and most importantly, for that little boy to keep fighting. Just before falling asleep, Michael made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Tomorrow, he would ask about becoming a foster parent. He had no idea how to raise a child, especially one who might have special needs after such a traumatic start to life. He didn't know the first thing about bottles or diapers or sleepless nights. But he did know about love, protection, and second chances. Sometimes, he realized, that's all anyone really needs to start with. The social services office was nothing like Michael had imagined. Instead of the cold, institutional setting he'd expected, he found himself in a warm room with colorful artwork on the walls, clearly drawn by children. Still, his palms were sweating as he filled out form after form, his police badge feeling unusually heavy on his belt. Single male, mid-40s, law enforcement. The social worker, Mrs. Chen, read from his application. She looked up at him with kind but searching eyes. "Officer Reynolds, I have to ask, what made you decide to become a foster parent?" Michael shifted in his chair, loosening his collar. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? "There's this baby," he started, then paused to clear his throat. "I found him 3 weeks ago, behind a store. He was just thrown away like garbage. But he fought to live. And now—" Mrs. Chen's expression softened as Michael told the whole story. The endless nights at the hospital, the tiny hand gripping his finger, the way his empty apartment suddenly felt too quiet. When he finished, she smiled. "You know, becoming a foster parent isn't easy," she explained, leaning forward. "There's training, home studies, background checks, and being a single father to an infant, that's going to be especially challenging." "I know it won't be easy," Michael replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The next few weeks became a whirlwind of activity. Michael's fellow officers watched in amazement as their bachelor colleague transformed his spare room into a nursery. They helped him paint the walls a soft green, assemble a crib, and learn the surprisingly complex art of installing a car seat. "You're really doing this, huh?" his partner Tom asked one day, watching Michael struggle with a baby-proofing lock. The guy who swore he'd never settle down. Michael looked around his apartment, at the diapers stacked neatly on shelves, the tiny clothes folded in drawers, the bottles sterilizing in the kitchen. "Life's funny sometimes," he said with a small smile. "You think you've got it all figured out, then something happens that changes everything." The foster parent training classes were eye-opening. Michael took detailed notes, asked countless questions, and stayed late to practice changing diapers on dolls until his technique was perfect. He learned about attachment theory, childhood development, and the special challenges faced by abandoned infants. But nothing prepared him for the skepticism he faced. Some questioned his motives. A single man wanting to foster a baby raised eyebrows. Others doubted his ability to handle both his demanding job and a child. The fact that he was white and the baby was black led to additional conversations about cultural competency and racial awareness. "How will you handle the questions?" one social worker asked during his home study. "The stares? The assumptions people might make?" Michael thought carefully before answering. With honesty, he said finally, "I can't control what other people think, but I can make sure this child grows up knowing his story, his heritage, and that family isn't about matching skin colors, it's about love." Each visit to the hospital showed him how right his decision was. The baby, whom he'd started calling James in his head, after his own father, was growing stronger every day. The nurses had noticed how he seemed to recognize Michael's voice, how he calmed when Michael held him. Finally, after what felt like endless evaluations and preparations, Mrs. Chen called with the news. He'd been approved as a foster parent. Michael sat down heavily on his couch, overwhelming emotion making his hands shake as he held the phone. "There's still paperwork to complete," Mrs. Chen was saying, "but you could bring him home as early as next week, assuming he's medically cleared." That night, Michael stood in the nursery, looking at everything he'd prepared. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting gentle shadows on the walls. A small stuffed elephant sat in the corner of the crib, the first gift he bought for James. It all felt surreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. His phone buzzed with messages from his fellow officers. Word had spread quickly through the precinct, and the support was overwhelming. They'd organized a schedule to help with night shifts, arranged meal deliveries, and even started a baby supplies collection. "Never thought I'd see the day," read one message from his captain. "But I've never been prouder of one of my officers. You're going to be a great dad, Mike." Standing there in the quiet nursery, Michael realized that this wasn't just about saving a life anymore. It was about building 2 lives, really. The empty spaces in his home and his heart were about to be filled in ways he never imagined possible. And though the road ahead would be challenging, he knew with absolute certainty that he was ready for this journey. "See you soon, James," he whispered to the empty crib, his voice full of promise. "We've got quite an adventure ahead of us." Time has a way of moving both slowly and quickly when you're raising a child. For Michael, the sleepless nights of James's infancy felt endless, yet somehow those days melted into years faster than he could have imagined. Each milestone became a celebration: the first smile, the first steps, the first word, "Dada," which made Michael cry, though he'd never admit it to his fellow officers. Learning to be a father meant discovering skills Michael never knew he needed. He learned to warm bottles one-handed while rocking a fussy baby, mastered the art of bedtime stories with different voices for each character, and most challenging of all, figure out how to braid hair by watching online tutorials late at night. "You're doing it wrong again, Dad," 5-year-old James giggled one morning as Michael attempted to tame his son's curls before school. "Oh yeah? Maybe you should do it yourself then," Michael teased, tickling James's sides until they'd both collapsed in laughter on the couch. These moments, the simple, everyday ones, were what Michael treasured most. But life wasn't always easy. The first time James came home from kindergarten crying because another child had asked why he didn't look like his dad, Michael's heart broke a little. They sat together on their favorite thinking spot, the porch swing, and had their first real talk about family and love. "You know what makes a family, buddy?" Michael asked, pulling James close. "It's not about looking the same. It's about loving each other, taking care of each other, and choosing each other every single day." James thought about this, his small face serious. "Like how you chose me when I was a baby." "Exactly like that. And it was the best choice I ever made." As James grew, so did their bond. Michael learned to coach Little League, despite knowing nothing about baseball at first. He stayed up late helping with science fair projects, attended every school play, even when James had only one line as tree number 3, and learned to cook more than just microwave dinners. Their neighborhood became used to the side of them, the white police officer and his black son, jogging together in the park, shopping for groceries, or working on James's bicycle in the driveway. Most people were kind, but there were still challenges. Michael had to learn to navigate difficult conversations about race, identity, and belonging. When James was 10, he started asking more questions about his birth parents. Michael had always been honest about James's story, keeping age-appropriate details in a special journal for when James was ready. Together, they looked through it, James tracing the newspaper clipping about his rescue with a thoughtful finger. "Were you scared when you found me?" James asked one evening, both of them sitting on the floor surrounded by old photos. Michael took a deep breath. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not as scared as I was about becoming a dad. Turns out that was the easy part. Loving you just came naturally." As James entered his teenage years, their relationship evolved. They dealt with homework stress, first crushes, and the inevitable arguments about curfews and phone privileges. But through it all, their bond remained unshakable. James grew into a thoughtful young man who made Michael proud every day. The police department became James' extended family. Officers who had known him since he was a baby became uncles and aunts. The break room that had once been filled with coffee and case files now sometimes hosted impromptu birthday celebrations and homework sessions. One particularly memorable day, 14-year-old James shadowed Michael at work for a school project. Watching his son interact with his colleagues, dressed in a mini police department t-shirt they'd given him, Michael felt overwhelmed with gratitude for how life had turned out. "You know," his partner Tom said, watching James expertly charm the dispatch team into giving him extra donuts, "that kid's the best thing that ever happened to this precinct. He's got your heart, Mike." Sports became their special bonding time. James joined the high school track team, and Michael never missed a meet. They started a tradition of Sunday morning basketball games, though as James grew taller, the matches became less competitive and more about Michael trying to keep up with his increasingly athletic son. "Come on, old man," James would tease, easily dribbling past Michael. "You're not tired already, are you?" "Just giving you a head start," Michael would huff back, loving every minute of it. There were hard times too. The night James got caught sneaking out to meet friends, their first real fight about college applications, the time James struggled with a bully at school. But they faced each challenge together, their unique bond growing stronger through every test. One evening, as they sat on their porch swing, now barely big enough for them both, James turned to Michael with a serious expression. Dad, you know how Mrs. Thompson asked us to write about our heroes for English class? Michael nodded, sipping his coffee. I wrote about you, James said quietly. Not because you're a police officer, but because you taught me that family is about choices we make every day. That love is stronger than anything else. Michael didn't try to hide the tears in his eyes this time. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sunset, father and son, not by blood, but by something far stronger, choice, love, and the countless moments that had built their life together. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon when a letter arrived. Michael had just finished his shift and was sorting through the mail at the kitchen counter, still in his uniform. Bills, advertisements, and then a certified letter from a law firm 2 states away. His heart skipped a beat as he noticed the official seal. The house was quiet except for the sound of James practicing his guitar upstairs. The familiar chords of his son's favorite song drifted down the stairs as Michael's trembling fingers opened the envelope. As he read the first few lines, he had to sit down, the kitchen chair scraping loudly against the floor. Dad, James called from upstairs. Everything okay? Yeah, buddy, Michael managed to reply, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in his hands. Just keep practicing. The letter was from a social worker representing James's biological mother. She had been found in a hospice facility across state lines. After years of battling addiction and mental health issues, she was in the final stages of liver failure. Her last wish was to meet her son before she passed away. Michael read the letter 3 times, each word feeling heavier than the last. The social worker had included medical records, court documents, and a handwritten note from James's mother herself. Her story was heartbreaking. A young woman who had struggled with severe mental illness, who had made a desperate choice on a cold December night 16 years ago. The sound of James's footsteps on the stairs snapped Michael back to the present. He quickly folded the letter, but not fast enough. What's that? James asked, grabbing a soda from the fridge. At 16, he was nearly as tall as Michael now, his lean frame carrying the confidence of youth. But when he saw his father's expression, he looked suddenly younger, more vulnerable. Sit down, son, Michael said softly. We need to talk. They moved to their familiar spot on the living room couch, where they'd had so many important conversations over the years. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the family photos that lined the walls. James's first day of school, baseball games, birthdays, and holidays. Is it about my birth mother? James asked quietly, surprising Michael. Maybe he'd sensed something like this would happen someday. Michael nodded, taking a deep breath. She's been found, he said gently. She's very sick, James. She's in a hospital, and she'd like to meet you. The silence that followed felt endless. James stared at the letter in Michael's hands, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think I should? Michael had faced countless difficult situations as a police officer, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He chose his words carefully. That's a decision only you can make, buddy, but whatever you choose, I'm right here with you. James stood up abruptly, pacing the living room. Why now? He asked, anger creeping into his voice. Why after 16 years? She didn't want me then. She threw me away like... His voice broke. Michael was on his feet instantly, pulling his son into a hug. James resisted for a moment before collapsing into the embrace, just like he used to do as a little boy after a nightmare. She was sick, son, Michael explained softly. The letter explains a lot. She's been fighting her own battles for a long time. Sometimes people make terrible choices when they're not well. They spent hours talking that evening, ordering pizza that grew cold as they discussed the possibilities. James read the letter himself, then read it again. He looked at the old photos Michael had kept from the early days, the hospital bracelet, the tiny hat the nurses had given him. What would you do? James finally asked, looking up at his father with eyes that held both hope and fear. Michael thought carefully before answering. I'd want to know my story, he said honestly. But James, meeting her doesn't change anything between us. You're my son, no matter what. That night, neither of them slept much. Michael could hear James moving around in his room, probably doing what he always did when stressed, organizing his basketball card collection. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on Michael's door. Dad, you awake? Come in, buddy. James sat on the edge of Michael's bed, just like he used to do during thunderstorms when he was little. "I think I want to meet her," he said quietly. "But I'm scared." Michael sat up, turning on the bedside lamp. "That's okay. Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. It means you're human. Will you come with me? Try and stop me," Michael smiled, squeezing his son's shoulder. As they sat there in the dim light, Michael thought about how far they'd come from that cold night behind the convenience store. Every choice, every moment had led to this. Tomorrow, they would call the social worker. They would make plans. They would face whatever came next together, just as they always had. Before going back to his room, James paused at the door. "Dad? Thank you. For everything." Michael watched his son walk away, his heart full of love and pride. The letter on his nightstand might change their lives again, but some things would never change. The bond between a father and son, built not on biology, but on love, choice, and thousands of small moments of being there for each other. The moment the investigator shared the details, the world around them seemed to pause. Hope's hands trembled as she listened to the story of her biological mother, a young girl barely out of childhood herself, trapped in a nightmare that no one should ever experience. Her mother had been just 15 when everything changed. Living in a small, struggling neighborhood where hope seemed like a luxury, she came from a family torn apart by poverty and personal struggles. Her parents worked multiple jobs, barely making ends meet, and the weight of their own survival left little room for emotional support. One summer evening changed everything. A trusted family friend, someone her parents had known for years, committed an unthinkable act of violence. In a single moment, her entire world shattered. The young girl found herself pregnant, alone, and completely overwhelmed by a pain too big for her young mind to process. As the investigator continued, Hope's adopted father sat beside her, his strong hand gently holding hers. The story unfolded like a fragile piece of cloth, revealing layers of hurt, survival, and impossible choices. Her biological mother had been alone, truly alone, with no one to turn to, no support system to catch her when she was falling. The decision to leave her newborn daughter wasn't made lightly. It wasn't about not loving her. It was a desperate act of a scared, traumatized child who saw no other way out. The young mother believed that by leaving her baby in a place where she might be found, she was giving her a chance at life. A chance she felt she couldn't provide. "I want to understand," Hope whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't blame her." Her father watched her carefully, seeing the mix of emotions swirling in her eyes: pain, compassion, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of empathy. They had always been close, but this moment felt different. It was like looking at the world through a completely new lens. The investigator shared more details. The biological mother had never fully recovered from the trauma. She had struggled with mental health challenges, moving between temporary jobs and struggling to find stability. But there was something else, a glimmer of hope. Records showed that despite her challenges, she had always wondered about her daughter. There were fragments of newspaper clippings, worn-out notes with questions about the baby she had been forced to leave behind. "She never stopped thinking about me," Hope said softly, tears forming in her eyes. It wasn't a statement of blame or anger. It was a revelation of connection, a thread of love that had somehow survived through impossible circumstances. Her father pulled her close. He had always been her rock, her protector. But now he became something more, a listener, a support system that allowed her to process this complex emotional journey. They talked for hours, breaking down the story piece by piece, allowing her to feel every emotion without judgment. Counseling became a crucial part of their journey. Hope worked with a therapist who specialized in adoption and trauma, helping her navigate the complex emotions that came with discovering her origins. She learned about resilience, about the strength it takes to survive, about the different forms love can take. What struck Hope most was the realization that her story wasn't just about loss, it was about survival. Her biological mother, despite experiencing unimaginable trauma, had made a choice that ultimately gave Hope a chance at life. And her adoptive father had transformed that chance into a beautiful, loving reality. The revelation didn't break their family. Instead, it made their bond stronger. Hope realized that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about commitment, about standing by each other through the most challenging moments. "I want to find her someday," Hope told her father one evening. Not to judge, just to understand. To show her that I'm okay, that I've had a good life. Her father looked at her with pride. The scared little girl he had rescued from a dumpster had grown into a compassionate, strong young woman who could look at her painful origin story and see beyond the hurt, to see the humanity. Their journey was far from over, but they would face it together with love, understanding, and an unbreakable bond that went far beyond any biological connection. Life has a way of turning pain into purpose, and Hope understood this better than most. After discovering the truth about her beginnings, she felt a calling deeper than any career path she could have imagined. Social work wasn't just a job for her, it was a mission, a way to transform her personal story into a beacon of hope for others. Her first job was at a community center in a neighborhood that reminded her of her biological mother's struggles. Young mothers, some barely teenagers, would walk through the doors with fear in their eyes and uncertainty in their steps. Hope saw herself in them, not as they were now, but as they could be. She started a support program specifically designed for young mothers facing impossible circumstances. It wasn't about judgment. It was about understanding, about providing a safety net that she knew her own biological mother never had. Each week, she would sit in a small room with worn-out chairs and faded posters, listening to stories that broke her heart and simultaneously filled her with hope. "You're stronger than you know," she would tell the young women. And she meant every word. She had lived it. She understood that strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting up again and again. Her adoptive father, now retired but still her biggest supporter, would often visit the center. He'd sit quietly in the corner, watching his daughter work her magic. The same hands that had once pulled her from a trash can now clasp together in quiet pride, witnessing the incredible woman she had become. The program grew. What started as a small initiative in one community center soon spread to multiple locations. Hope developed workshops, created support networks, and became a voice for those who felt voiceless. She worked with local schools, hospitals, and community organizations, building a comprehensive support system for young mothers. But it wasn't always easy. Some days were tough. Some stories reminded her too closely of her own past. On those days, her father would be there. Sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes with just a silent hug. No words were needed, they had a connection that went beyond language. One particular case changed everything. A young mother, just 16, came to the center. Her situation was hauntingly similar to Hope's biological mother's story. Scared, alone, with no support system. Hope saw a reflection of what could have been, a potential story of loss and pain. But this time, things would be different. Hope worked tirelessly with the young mother. They found her safe housing, connected her with counseling, created a support network. And slowly, day by day, hope began to replace fear. The young mother decided to keep her baby, but more importantly, she found her own strength. "You're not alone," Hope would tell her, remembering the same words her father had always told her. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. Hope realized that her life's purpose wasn't just about helping young mothers. It was about breaking cycles of pain, about showing people that their circumstances don't define their future. Her adoptive father watched all of this with a mix of pride and wonder. The tiny baby he had rescued years ago had become a force of change, not through grand gestures, but through quiet, consistent compassion. They would often sit together in the evenings, sharing meals and conversations that went deep into the night. He would tell her stories about his years in law enforcement, and she would share stories from her work. Two different paths, but connected by the same fundamental belief that every life matters, that every person deserves a chance. As years passed, Hope's work gained recognition. Awards came, but they meant little compared to the lives she had touched. She wasn't interested in accolades. She was interested in change. Her biological mother remained a constant, gentle presence in her heart. Hope never stopped hoping that one day they might meet, not to blame, not to judge, but to understand, to heal. And so, the little girl found in a trash can become a woman who turned pain into purpose. She became a beacon of hope, a reminder that our beginnings do not determine our endings. That love, in all its complex, beautiful forms, can transform lives. Her story was a testament to the power of compassion, of second chances, of the family we choose and the love that chooses us.